Hello and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name is Sam Hagan and I manage the library's public programming team. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on country this evening. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. This land always was, always will be Aboriginal land. A bit of news before I hand over to Bree. Back at the library, we're busy planning next year's program and preparing to deliver it both live, on site and online in some iteration. There'll be more information coming about 2021 soon, so please keep checking the website, or you can sign up for the monthly library e-newsletter. Just jump on the library's website. Welcome to the library's favourite book club, the B List with Bree Lee. And this evening we're crossing time zones with our B-list guest dialing in from New York. I'm going to hand over to Bree and this evening's guest in a moment. But before I do, I just want to remind you about an event you may be interested in that's happening on Thursday, the 12th of November, a conversation between Dr. Jane Park and Michaela Kalowski about the Korean novel Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which is authored by Cho Nam-yu. Anyway, Bea will have some more news about the next B-list event, which I'm also really excited about. So I'm going to hand over to her. Are you with me, Bree?
Hello, thank you, Sam. Sure am. Good evening, everybody. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I am here in beautiful Sydney, which is Gadigal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And when I say that, I mean I'm also acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded. We still don't have a treaty, and I personally support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We are here to have another very special international B-list. As I've said before, I think it has been a real silver lining of COVID that people are more inclined to make their beautiful brains accessible to a sort of international brains trust and be able to do events like this. And it's a great credit to the library in particular, and I thank them for continuing to make these events free. I'm hearing from a lot of people, even just people with kids, people who live outside of Sydney, that being able to tune into these book clubs at no cost is really wonderful for them. And I'm really grateful for that as well. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Rumaan Alam, who lives in Brooklyn, which is why we had to pre-record. But I have heard from some of you via social media that you have questions for Rumaan, and I'm going to put a couple of those to him at the end of tonight's event. This is a literary thriller, I think, is what people are calling it. I don't really care what it's called. I absolutely loved it, and I'm so excited to get to talk to him. Rumaan Alam is the author of Rich and Pretty and That Kind of Mother. This, Leave the World Behind, is his third novel. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, New York Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Book Forum, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, where he is tonight to join us. Rumaan, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And I have to say that I echo your sentiment that the silver lining of this moment is the ability to talk to readers in Sydney, like what a particular thrill it is. And I'm so happy. And especially I'm mindful of, as you said, readers who are at home looking after children who can't get out to these sorts of events in normal life, but have access to this. It's such a great, great gift. And so happy to be here tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And congratulations. This is going gangbusters.
Yes, thank you.
I didn't mention in the introduction, but for anyone watching, it has been shortlisted for the National Book Award and it's been optioned for a big movie with super mega stars. Yeah, I just wanted to say congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been such a difficult year, and I've had friends who have got married or who have had babies this year. And what I've said to them is that any moment of joy is just a reminder that like you have to hold on to those moments of joy. And so I've had a great year professionally. And I hope that other people find some excitement in that it's a reminder that like, you know, the world still has things to offer us and there's still things to work for. And so it's a thrill. I'm totally thrilled.
I also, when I was planning my questions for you, I realized that I also felt like I wanted to congratulate you for your country's removal of Trump. Like, it's just this like, oh, congratulations. Like,
it does certainly feel like a cathartic moment for citizens the world over. And I am very happy about that. Very, very happy about that. I think there's a lot yet to confront in our politics in this country and abroad, but there's also a lot to hold on to. And again, I think you have to take those moments of joy where you can find them.
Absolutely. All right, I want to get straight into my questions for you. As I mentioned, I loved this book so much. I know you've probably had to do it a million times, but could you humor me once more and introduce us to our sort of core cast and where we meet them in their car on the road?
Sure. So Leave the World Behind is the story of a well-to-do Brooklyn family of four. They're sort of a striving middle-class family. Amanda is an account director at an ad agency. Her husband, Clay, is a professor. And they have two teenage children, Archie and Rose. And they're heading out for a summer holiday. It's one of those sort of last summer holidays where the children are still young enough to be dragged along on family vacation. They're going to a part of New York State where my own family vacations quite often. And they're just gonna hang out at the pool, go to the beach, grill hamburgers, do all the kinds of things that families do when we're not amidst a global pandemic and we're able to go on holiday. And the second night of their stay in a house they've rented via Airbnb, there's a knock at the door. And they're not expecting anybody. They're in this isolated place. They don't know who it could possibly be. It's an older Black couple who tell them that this is their house. They're the ones who have rented it to them via Airbnb. And they're there because there's been an emergency in New York City. There's been a blackout. And they've come seeking refuge in the home they own. And from there, the book shifts from being a sort of a domestic comedy of manners about a middle-class family on the road to a book about six people inside of a home, unable to really understand what's happening outside of the walls of that house.
The book moves incredibly quickly. I think it's amazing what you've been able to achieve in such like a tight amount of pages and words. But I'm interested in, at the beginning, how much space is given to Amanda's shopping trip and the beauty of this Airbnb home. And I was listening to a podcast that you had been on, I think in October, talking about the book. And you mentioned that one of the greatest compliments that you'd received at that time about the book was that the early pages read like an indictment of in particular Amanda, but of this sort of upper white middle class family. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the beginning of the book is very concerned with materiality, in part because I think that's the culture that we share. I was going to say that's the culture in this country, but I think it's sort of the culture globally at this point, commerce. When sketching out this character in the early pages, that's what the early pages of a book always do, is introduce you to the players. Rather than describe Amanda's physicality, I'm much more interested in this question of who she is. And to me, the question of what you buy at the grocery store on your way to a week-long holiday is the story of who you are. Our things become the story of who we are. And the things that we buy to eat in particular are the story. It's a very intimate story. It's the story of who we are and what we're telling our family. That we are the family who eats heritage beef or free-range chicken or organic eggs, but we are also a family who likes these sort of chemically processed donuts. We're the family who buys the recycled paper coffee filters because that says who we are politically, that says what we think about is important, and we're putting our money where our mouths are. That's very interesting to me, the materiality of the home in which they find themselves. I mean, I'm looking at your rainbow organized shelves behind you, right? It's a perfect example of, it's an intimate gesture. It's your own home. It's the story you're telling yourself about who you are and what you find beautiful and the way you choose to live your life. The reader, especially the middle-class reader, and the novel is sort of fundamentally middle-class endeavor and entertainment, hopefully recognizes that. And they understand who these people are simply by listing the things that they bought or the things that they have around them. The fancy dishwasher, a certain kind of vacuum cleaner, a certain kind of washing machine, a certain kind of floor, the pot filler over the sink. The person who has a pot filler over the sink is a very specific kind of person. And it's a way of establishing character, a way of establishing class and type that I like to think is very efficient, but it's the reader's judgment, not my own, I guess.
And then there's the obviously hugely laden moment when Amanda is when she meets this couple at the door, and she thinks to herself like that this beautiful home that for her is very aspirational, with its pot filler over the sink in the oven, and just how well it's been designed. She did not anticipate that this home would belong to a Black couple, and
Yeah.
that makes her wonder if they are like intruders or
Yeah.
that it's a scam.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a note for, I had a note for myself that there is a Karen quality to Amanda.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think what I hope for the reader in confronting that is a complicated response. Because when you talk about the Karen, right, the white person who attains sort of social media notoriety for a plain wrongdoing that's caught on film and sort of disseminated out into the world, those are very easy to understand where you see it's the morality of those is very easy to comprehend. What's more complicated about this encounter between whiteness and Blackness on the doorstep of this fictional house is that the reader isn't entirely certain whether these people, these Black people, are who they say they are. Which means that you automatically then understand Amanda's position. And even as the book clarifies the terms, and you do understand it's not a crime that's taking place, I hope that you can't help but feel some kind of understanding that Amanda, in her racist knee-jerk response to the arrival of these Black people, is also a victim herself of a narrative that society has given her from birth. Especially white women are given this narrative from a very young age, that Blackness and Black masculinity in particular are to be feared. And so then how do you respond? And her response, which is to worry over her children asleep down the hall, is both irrational and reasonable. So it's a very tricky, and even the Black people, George and Ruth are their names, comport themselves with an understanding that in this scenario, they should be on guard, that George approaching the door should hold his hands up as though he had been pulled over by the police, even though he's done nothing wrong. It's his home. He has the keys to the house. This
is something I wanted to ask you about as well, because George in particular, and Ruth as well, but George in particular is very aware of like putting them at ease. And one of the ways he does that is to essentially to demonstrate his wealth. How different, completely different, I feel, but I would love to hear you talk about how different this story would be if George and Ruth were not so very moneyed.
Yes, I think that it is an essential aspect of this tension that George and Ruth are rich and that they possess a kind of power over Clay and Amanda by virtue of their wealth. Because again, Clay and Amanda as Americans care deeply about money, as middle-class Americans care deeply about an aspiration to the next level of money. Amidst this crisis, and this is sort of like a subtle thing that a New York reader will really comprehend, but amidst this crisis, Amanda, upon learning that Ruth has a relationship to one of New York's very fanciest private schools, wonders to herself whether this is an opportunity to secure a better education for her children, so that even amidst a situation in which something potentially devastating has happened in the world, her first concern is like the personal advancement and a class advancement.
Absolutely. I want to talk as well because about, I suppose George in particular, he has this like belief in money. Like, I don't want anyone who's listening who hasn't read the book yet to think Amanda and Clay is this like, purely horrible racist couple, and George and Ruth are these like perfect other side sort of counterpoints in any way. George talks about money as though like people are in control of whether they're rich or poor, as though it's just about trying hard enough to be rich. And then there's a moment when he sort of either doesn't or can't articulate why he sort of just doesn't like Obama.
In my experience, limited, albeit, with very rich people, they can talk about money almost the way people talk about faith. And that is, to me, how George talks about money. It's almost mystical, this notion that the market will correct everything, that the market's response to anything, whether you're talking about what's happening to the climate, whether you're talking about what's happening politically, whether you're talking about coronavirus, that the market will show some wisdom in some way forward. Indeed, today, the day that you and I are speaking, Pfizer announced that they had some degree of success with a coronavirus vaccine. And what happened, what the New York Times told me happened, is that this had an effect on the market, that this affected the price of Zoom, the video networking software, because of an assumption that somehow this advancement in science is connected to the market, which is perhaps valid, but I think frankly insane. And this is how money talks about itself. And to me, that is how I have known men like George, mostly younger men, who have this way of talking about their calling at a bank or at an investment firm, as though it's, it's like how Thomas Hardy would write about a monk,
And then there's also like the whole extra level of the morality to that. Like Ruth in particular sort of backs up that sort of faith in money of George's she's pretty judgmental that this family is like kind of just making a mess. Like she doesn't like how like messy they are. Yeah. But also that brings me to something I wanted to hear you talk about, which is I'd never read like the shift in power dynamics when you don't know who's the owner of the house versus who is the guest in the house. And this like very strange in-between space, the four adults in particular, especially as like two heterosexual couples, this kind of dancing around the fact that one couple has like paid to rent it, but the other couple actually own it. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how fraught that is? And in particular, it seemed like that happened at sort of meal times or anything where they were all together. Like that was fascinating.
I think it's one of those things about contemporary life that is as yet unresolved in art, much like the way I talk about the cell phone in this book. It's a change in the way that we approach leisure that we haven't entirely reckoned with. So, if you were going to a hotel, you understand yourself as the guest of a hotel and that you're paying for a certain kind of experience. What's being described in this book is not that. Even under the prevailing conditions, which we don't understand and the characters don't understand, they understand that something has happened in the world outside and all they know is that they are here together. They have to negotiate what that will look like for the however long they think they're going to be together. And they're not able to do it. And they're not able to do it without talking about money. It's money that helps clarify. George, in order to reestablish his possession of the house, offers them a refund on the money that they've paid him. To him, it's an incidental sum of money. To them, it's a significant sum of money. It's their vacation fund. And not only that, he offers it to them in cash. He simply has a couple of $1,000s lying around. This is an extraordinary gesture that has less to do with the dollar amount and more to do with the power. Money and power are deeply, deeply connected, not just in sort of big abstract terms, but in the very immediate terms that we see being played out as they negotiate. When they're eating, there's a scene in which they're all eating at the pool and Ruth brings out the cherries from the fridge and Amanda thinks, I paid $12 for those cherries. It's a very particular way of thinking about money and possession that you would only think that way if spending $12 on cherries was a significant investment for you.
I remember it being quite, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, just
that when there's a scene quite late in the book, no spoilers, but Amanda is under extreme pressure. And there's just this constant question about whether they leave the home or whether they stay and whether they drive somewhere. And Amanda is like, despite being in an absolute panic, still is like wondering whether they will try and make a run for it in the Washington couple's expensive car. Yeah. Like even when she is under like this absolute like crazy stress and pressure, it's not just like, will they try and drive away? Will they try and drive away in their expensive car? Yeah. Like it never stops. It's very,
these are the terms of the culture. These are the
Mm.
terms of our culture, and it's very difficult to separate yourself from the dominant narrative that you have been taught your entire life.
Mm.
And there's a board game I saw once, a card game or something. It's truly disturbing, which uses corporate logos, and you're meant to guess what the corporate logo is when it's been stripped of language. And I was playing it with a kid, my husband's godson, who was probably like 9 at the time. And it was incredible to me that he was able to identify Federal Express, right? Or British Petroleum, right? Based simply on what the logo looks like. There's no reason for a 9-year-old to know what FedEx is. But it is part of the language of the world, and children are paying attention. And so this language of the world it's getting through to us without our realizing it. And so subconsciously, even in a moment of crisis, if you were literally fleeing a dangerous situation and forced to say, okay, should we take the Subaru or the Mercedes? You would even that you would even linger on that as a question says a lot about the society in which we are participating.
I want to talk to you about the writing style and the perspectives. And in any one sort of page or one of these short chapters, I'm not sure how you would describe it, like a kind of shifting third person. I'm not worried about like the terminology, but I'd love to hear about whether or not, like, was there at any stage when you were working on this novel that there was a sort of particular protagonist or someone that you stayed with, or was it always a part of this book that we see the sort of inner workings of all 6 characters and very much sort of pinball between them, like throughout the narrative?
Mm-hmm. That is a clarity that came into the process. So essentially, the way, if the book is moving or deriving some momentum from the notion of being a thriller, right? Or like it's sort of the momentum comes from a sense of mystery. The characters don't know what's happening to them, and we're watching that play out. At a certain point, when I was revising this book with my editor, she pointed out to me that it's frustrating for the reader. The reader needs to know a little more than the characters know. And so the realization was simply that I could use a different kind of perspective. And so the way I have been describing it is God's perspective. So the characters are fretting back and forth over what's happening in the world. And at a certain point, the book simply starts telling the reader, okay, this is happening. This is happening. This has happened. This person is lying. This person doesn't know that what they're saying is not entirely true. And it really clarified a lot to me about the project. And yes, I think it is a shifting perspective, right? We get to be inside of everyone's head momentarily and bounce along. And I found that really liberating. I do think that there's a way in which the protagonists are the white couple, Clay and Amanda, but I hope that it is also fair to say you have access to enough of the other 4 characters that it really is a group portrait or a group study.
You, the sort of the omniscient narrator drops these kinds of breadcrumbs, like more and more towards later, about what is happening, like what we haven't even talked about what's happening. I know it's like, no, I don't really, it's not the point if there is any point in any book anyway, but I mean, how do you like that? As when I was just reading it for the first time, those were such like value heavy sentences, like so much information in these little bits that, and it's value heavy because sort of there are huge ramifications of, you know, what's been happening like back in the city or elsewhere in the country. And it's also the stakes are so high because I'm, as a reader, hearing something that the characters are as yet unaware of. Like, how do you, I don't know, I feel like, do you place those with tweezers? Like, how do you decide when and where those appear?
So yes, the characters begin the book with George and Ruth asserting that there has been a blackout in New York City. And Clay and Amanda don't necessarily believe them because they still have power at this house that is not far from New York City. And so, you know, their assertion is belied by the fact that they still have power. So they don't really believe it. Increasingly, there's a suggestion to the characters that maybe there is some accuracy in what they're saying, that maybe there is something amiss. It's a little like, were I to write a murder mystery and not solve the murder, it would have been deeply frustrating for the reader. So I need to clarify some of what this event is, some of what the circumstances of this blackout are. But as you said in the setup to this question, it's not really the point. It's simply an external pressure because the point is to show you how these people respond. And so the strategy for me, and I feel like people don't necessarily believe me when I say this, is that I myself don't really know what's happened. I don't have some grand plan for like, okay, here's what it is, and here are the tiny details I will tell you. The way I approach, but the book does say, this has happened in Maryland. This has happened in New York City. This has happened, a plane crashed over Montana or somewhere. What I did to come up with those things is I tried to choose things that I found really chilling and really effective, some very small, some very big. I also tried to choose the kinds of things that you might get a push alert about on your phone, so that you may theoretically be at dinner at a restaurant, having a hamburger after work with some friends. Get an alert on your phone that a plane has crashed in Malaysia and look at it and put it down and go on with your dinner. You may get an alert that a woman in Maryland has drowned her 2 children in the bathtub, a horrific crime for sure. That is the kind of thing that would rise to that level of communique. How would you feel about it? What would you do with that information? And I think what the book tries to force you to do is it makes you into a conspiracy theorist. You're forced to take all these pieces of information and try to assemble a whole, but the whole it's impossible. You'll never get there because I myself don't have one in mind. So you're just forced to reckon with the fact that information, we live in the information age, right? Information is always flying at us. It's not enough.
Let's talk about phones, because we could talk about phones and this book for the whole hour anyway. But
we could.
I think I have complex negative feelings about Clay, and I think phones are like a particularly interesting time maybe to discuss Clay, because he in particular seems to be, I mean, he expresses it himself. I can't remember if he says it out loud, but he certainly is thinking it, that basically when he doesn't have a phone, he's like rendered completely useless. Like he has nothing to sort of offer any situation. He tries to drive to find out some information and he gets turned around and he just sort of is walking around being like, what's happening? I don't know. And he's just feels useless. I mean, what is that? So the other thing I was thinking about is that, you know, when we read thrillers, the sort of like, you know, in the peak of the Stephen King era or whatever, so, or even when we watch thrillers on as movies or TV shows, one thing that often we think about now is just how completely different all of the plots would be if people had mobile phones.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my favorite observations that I've ever heard anyone make is that the entirety of the television show Seinfeld makes no sense if it takes place in a post-cell phone universe.
Yeah.
Right? Which is an extraordinary realization.
Yeah.
I empathize with Clay. I mean, I'm deeply reliant on my phone, deeply. And I will use the phone to navigate on a drive I make all the time, right? I will use the phone to double check the amounts of a recipe I have made dozens of times that I should possess inside of my body. But I'm also old enough to remember a time in which you wrote down directions on a piece of paper before you got into the car because you were getting onto the highway and you needed to remember what exit you had to take, and you could use the signs, but you know, that's just how you conducted yourself in the world. That world isn't the world we live in anymore. And my children will grow up in a world that's quite different. I think we're fundamentally rewiring the way the brain works, neither good nor bad, simply something to reckon with. And Clay, I think your response to Clay is not just as a measure of his reliance on the phone. It's a response to his particular masculine hubris that like he can solve this problem. he can roll his sleeves up and be the dad who takes care of things, maybe that is just a fallacy. I think it shows, the book shows that to be a fallacy. But I do think the phone is really doing something to people, and it is doing something to people. I think art needs to grapple with what it is doing to people.
Because it's not just the, I liked the way you used not just the phone and in terms of, okay, we can no longer call or text each other, but also specifically with the news alerts and the idea of information and how destabilizing it is for Amanda and then the others when Amanda like sees some push notifications, but then one is garbled and then they disappear. And all of them keep sort of supporting each other in this belief. And George does it, excuse me, as well, where they somehow think that they would be able to sort themselves out if they just had the information.
Yeah. Yes.
And that they can just
I think is, yes.
Yeah.
Which is, to me, the biggest fallacy that they cling to. One of the, I mean, so yes, Amanda early in the book gets a push notification that is garbled. To me, that is one of the most chilling aspects of the book. The notion that CNN or the New York Times, a great technological and journalistic institution, if that is failing, that suggests a real problem at hand. But they don't even really think about it in those terms. They dismiss it and they say, well, something is wrong with the phone, something is wrong with the network. I mean, these are all they're too frightening to hold on to. And so rather than look at what they don't know, which is a terrifying prospect, they focus on the fact that they don't know it. And they're like, well, if only we knew, we would know how to respond. We saw this in this country anyway with coronavirus. We were told all of these things and simply accepted them. We were told not to wear masks in this country. I feel like that's forgotten, weirdly. We were told not to wear masks in the beginning, in February. We were told that they had nothing to do with anything, and that in fact they could inhibit your breathing, especially if you were a child. I mean, obviously that's wrong, and obviously that's incorrect, and has no basis in any kind of science, but that is what we were told. We have this fundamental instinct to obey, to wait for our mom and dad to say, here's what you're going to do. Here's the problem. Here's what we're going to do. When that order, that parental order is not forthcoming, it's really chilling. It's really chilling. And that is what plays out in this book, that mom and dad have left and we are just home alone and we don't know what to do.
There is a scene that I found, one particular scene, I want to say it happens around in the middle third of the book, that I found the most upsetting. And it's when Clay has gone for a drive. And this is like a tiny spoiler, but it's worth it because I really want to talk to you about it. I'm like struggling to even articulate it. It's just so awful. But I want to talk about it because I think it's very value laden. Clay goes for a drive. He's gone out by himself to try and get to the nearest town to find information. And he's like, he gets lost. He lies to himself about whether or not he's lost, but he's driving around. He very much doesn't know where he is because he's sort of just started going on autopilot rather than having ever taken notes, etc. And he comes across a woman on the side of the road, and this is the first other person he's seen. And he pulls over, and this woman is obviously very upset. She's sort of panicking. She's, you can tell she's sort of asking for something or pleading for some help. But she's speaking Spanish. He doesn't speak Spanish. And I was hoping you could talk about this sort of process that Clay seems to go through, where he eventually feels basically like angry at her and gets so defensive and behaves, I would say, in the way that most of us should be terrified that we would behave were we under a situation of this kind of pressure.
Yes. He's lost. He's trying to solve a problem on behalf of his family. He's trying to be the hero and is ashamed, I think, that he has got lost, that he has bungled his opportunity to be the hero. And then he's confronted with this woman who, I think the book is quite clear that she's a domestic servant of some sort. She's, unable to communicate with him, and they don't share a language. But she's crying. It's very clear that she is upset. Part of the stakes of this book, I think, as I described with Amanda having a kind of knee-jerk racist response, you're able to say, oh yes, that's indefensible. But then I hope that you're also able to walk back and say, well, maybe I can defend it. And maybe I can understand how if my sister were home alone with her children and a Black guy knocked on the door and she responded out of fear, I could say, all right, I understand. Maybe you're right to be attentive, you're right to be paying attention, you're right to be focused on what's going to happen next. You're not just racist. That there's this complicated spectrum into which we have to place ourselves. When we tell stories about the Second World War, the stories we tell, rightly, I think, are the stories of the heroes, right? The people who said, oh, you're not going to take my neighbor away. I will hide them in the barn or whatever. We all love those stories. I don't know that we can really grapple with the story of the people who said, oh, it's too bad that you're taking my neighbor away, but my life goes on. There were far more of the latter than the former. Who are we in this moment? I don't know if it's an easy question to answer. In this country, in the last 4 years, we had a political power that was separating children from their parents, people who would come to this country for political asylum, separating children, babies, shipping their parents abroad, handing the babies into a social welfare system, and being done with it. I don't support that. It's abhorrent. But what did I do? What can I do? I mean, it's very easy to say to yourself, well, what can I do? And I don't know. I don't have an easy answer to what I could have done. I know what I didn't do. I didn't do anything. I'm not a hero. You want to believe that in the moment of crisis, you would respond nobly. I don't know if we are all noble. Clay is not noble in that moment. He's afraid. Hearing this woman speak Spanish to him is a moment of fear for him. He rolls the windows of the car up and drives away. He's offended when she touches the car, pleading for assistance. It is not a defensible response, but it is a response I can comprehend.
One of the things I think that made me feel like it was indefensible was in the moment, he kept sort of telling himself that if only his phone worked and he had Google Translate, then he would be able to, so there would be some sort of bridge between them. And it's only sort of chewing on it later that he starts to, we see hints that maybe he does feel ashamed of how he behaved.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a tremendous, tremendous moral failing. But don't we all have those moments?
Yeah, but it's terrifying to think
of regret, where you're just like, oh, why didn't I give this panhandler $5? Like, what do I care about $5? Why didn't I just say, here, take $5? Like, it doesn't cost me, it cost me literally nothing. Why didn't I do it? We all have those moments, and we don't always respond nobly. I've seen people in crisis on the subway, and as an adult have the ability to turn my eyes off and to turn my intellect off and not respond to it as the moral outrage that it is, to not say this is deranged. Why do we accept a system? I live in the United States. We have enough money to do anything we want. Why do I accept my participation in a system that doesn't say, oh, people who are profoundly ill require intervention on the part of the state?
Australia has a very analogous to what you were saying before about the US separating the children from asylum seekers. Our offshore processing regime of calling Manus Processing Center that when it's actually a prison, and these are asylum seekers and refugees, and we put them in torturous conditions. I mean, you it's one thing to ask yourself, well, what could I have done? It's another thing to ask yourself, well, what did I do?
Yeah.
Because the answer to the second question is nothing, unless,
yeah,
it's. I think a question I have is, do you think one of the enduring appeals of, in some senses, I suppose you could call this like a post-apocalyptic novel, or like a during apocalyptic
pre-apocalyptic, yeah.
apocalyptic novel. I mean, do you think that's one of the enduring appeals of, broadly speaking, this kind of area of subject matter / this genre, is just like, who really are we in the pressure cooker?
For sure. I think it allows you to dial it up to an almost cartoonish level, and you still find what you recognize in that scenario. And we see this in every classic of the genre, even like the Hunger Games, right? You can locate the indictment of the contemporary society, but say, oh, well, this is a bigger, broader thing that's talking about some society we are not yet. So yes, I think that's the aim of that particular form. But I'm also mindful that this is a literary novel. And so part of the aim of the literary novel, I mean, the novel is a middle-class entertainment, like, you know, and so you go to that almost to see yourself reflected. And so there's a real discomfort, I hope, for the reader. Like, part of the chill of this moment is part of the frightening thing of the book is not just the big, broad things being described. It's these tiny moments that the reader will hopefully recognize herself and say, well, I buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And it makes me feel like I've taken a stand and I've said, like, well, I'm pro-choice. So of course I buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream, right? And I find comfort in that. Would I be the person in a dire moment who stopped on the side of the road and helped a stranger in crisis to whom I wasn't able to speak? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I find that very scary.
While we're on genres, like I'm interested to hear about whether you, like people are calling this a literary thriller, which I get because it is a literary novel and has many of the like best sort of elements that people love about thrillers. Do you read thrillers, or did you have to go out and read them as research for this particular book?
I did read a couple as research to understand the particular like technical strategy of how a book parcels out information or how a chapter bleeds into the next. But there's also a way, I mean, I think horror is an interesting touchstone to use when talking about this book. And there's a way in which the conventions of horror are so much a part of our culture that even if you are unable to watch scary movies or unable to read scary books, you know these narrative conventions. You know that when a group is together and one person gets separated, something bad is going to happen to that one person, right? You know that when someone says like, oh, I'm not feeling well in a world like I'm describing, that is not a good sign.
Yep.
And so the book is able to deploy all of these narrative strategies, and the reader has a very immediate response to them, regardless of how familiar she is with how those things work in Stephen King or in thriller novels, you know?
Animals was one of the things for me. Like, for anyone that hasn't read it, you know, we would have seen the cover with the deer, and it's like relatively early on that Rose, the young girl, sees this. It's not just a family of deer, it's like a I don't know, what do you call that? Like a herd, a huge herd of deer. Yeah. And that was one of the things where I was like, oh, I know this, like the animals know something we don't. Like,
yeah. And when you say that, what you're talking about, you know it because of contemporary narrative, but it's as old as folklore and myth, right? Like Aboriginal peoples the world over have these stories about animal intelligence or people paying attention to what's happening in the world around them. One of my favorite of these stories, and I wish I could remember the name of this particular people, but it has to do with the tsunami of 2012. Was it 2012? I'm forgetting the date, but the Indian Ocean tsunami, in which there is a sea-based people, I believe in Indonesia, who knew the tsunami was coming because they have a story about when the ocean went away, about the ocean pulling back, and they all left their homes on boats for land. So it's not something that anyone had experienced within the space of a generation, but it was something that existed in the folklore, in the body of like collective intelligence. I find that so fascinating. And we have these stories about the intelligence of animals in every culture, I think, not even deployed metaphorically. I mean, literally, there's a sense of like, okay, if you need to know when it's raining, you should see how when it's going to rain, you watch how the frogs will behave, and it will tell you. And the deer in this book are certainly an indication, I think, of something is happening in the world in which these characters live, but they choose not to see it.
I only have time for one more of my questions, and then I have two sort of audience questions. I want to know, this is just something I'm personally really curious about. You seem to be very immersed in the world of words and writing. You know, you studied writing as an undergrad, now you teach writing, you worked for magazines and publishing for a while, you make podcasts about writing and processes. Does that, I guess, sort of fuel your ability to do your own work, or is it kind of a noise that you have to sometimes be able to turn down to focus on your own work?
That is a really good question. I think the answer is both. I think it's the thing I care about deeply. To be a writer, you have to be a reader, right? And so you care about thinking about how these different writers are working. And it's a privilege to be able to make money weighing in on books, to spend 2,000 words picking apart how a book has worked on you. It's such a great joy. It is almost certainly the case that it informs what I do as a writer of fiction myself. I just wrote about a book for the New Republic by the artist Celia Paul. It's a memoir of her life called Self-Portrait. I feel like I learned so much about how to write from reading this book by a painter who is not even a writer. Like, that's not her trade. The way in which she sort of weaves the narrative of her life around art and around these sort of tiny sort of themes. It's an extraordinary book. I don't know necessarily what that will inform when it comes to my writing a next book, but it's sitting in there in this sort of pool of intelligence. And when I look at Leave the World Behind, I'm able to isolate all of the texts that informed that writing, whether it's Stephen King, who we've mentioned, or Edward Albee, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, had a huge effect on how I thought about this book. Or there's a film by Michael Haneke called Funny Games that had a huge effect on how I conceived of how the book would work. So you're always absorbing influence, but there is a point at which I think you have to know to turn it off and turn it down. And when I'm deep in the revision of a book and really getting at like making it work, I'm not reading. I do a lot of crossword puzzles. That's what I do to try and relax, because I need to relax. I need to like turn my mind off before I go to bed, and I can't fall asleep without reading something. So when I'm at that point where I can't read, I do crossword puzzles on my phone, of course.
That's good. A couple of writers I've either interviewed or read interviews with say that when they get to that stage where they're reviewing, like editing their own work, and it's when Didion says she has to sleep with the book in the same room. They can only read poetry because they still want to be reading, like you just mentioned. You still have this urge to be reading, but it has to be poetry. It can't be anything that will sort of worm its way in or something. I thought that was interesting. Okay, two really great questions. First one from Veronica. I just want to hear his thoughts about how freakishly resonant this is to then COVID, obviously. And then I wanted to add to this that I heard in a podcast that you delivered your final draft of this novel in January 2020, which means this is eerie.
Yeah, the metaphor of the book is people trapped in a house. And I could not have foreseen that we were going to publish this book into a reality in which many of the readers are themselves trapped inside of a house. It was a metaphor. It was a metaphor for the climate. The abiding concern of the book as I conceived it was the climate. The house is the planet. We are all trapped on the planet. There is nothing we can do. It doesn't matter how nice the house is. Here we are. It is weird that that became so literal in the culture. I'd also say, though, that I think that this is something that book does is we say it's predictive, but it's not. It's simply what's the word? It's like it's metabolizing what we are all already feeling. It's establishing or clarifying what has already been felt. This is a moment of particular uncertainty as relates to coronavirus, but in a strange way, coronavirus has provided a very tangible thing to hold on to describe a larger feeling of uncertainty that people of a certain generation will tell you has to do with 9/11. People who are a little older will tell you it has to do with the day man landed on the moon. People who are older yet, who may not even be alive anymore, will tell you this has to do with VE Day, right? Maybe uncertainty is simply the only given. And maybe this is always how it feels. It's difficult to reckon with, but maybe that is how it always feels.
That's a beautiful response. And this question from Kristen. I'd love to know if he had an event in mind, or you've sort of already answered this a bit, but it's still good. I'd love to know if he had an event in mind that he thinks was happening that ties all the parts together. So that's like the animals, and then the terrifying scenes about people getting trapped in underground public transport and stuff. Or if he chose incidents that didn't necessarily lead to a particular overarching event. Perhaps it's more unsettling that way. Dying to know from a conceptual perspective, but also process-wise.
I do think it is much more unsettling to not know. And I do think it leads you to a more satisfying reading of the book, right? A murder mystery has to tell you who the killer is. And you know who the killer is, and you get to sort of feel that relief that you've solved this problem. This is not a book about a problem so easily solved. This is a book about contemporary reality. It's much more terrifying to understand, even as we do right now in this country where Donald Trump's presidency's days are numbered. And that sense of relief comes hand in hand with a reminder that like, oh, we haven't rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. We haven't defeated coronavirus. The economy in this country is in a shambles, at least for working people, right? I'm not affected by this, but this country has given our working citizens $600 since this all began. $600. That's 1/3 of 1/4 of what I pay in rent, right? 1/3 of what I pay for health insurance a month. How could a family possibly survive on such a, it's an insult. It's very difficult to like reckon with these bigger, more complicated problems, but the book is less to me about what those problems are and more about the response that these six people have to those problems. And what response are we having right now as readers to the problems of the planet? That is to me much scarier than anything I could make up about alien invasion or nuclear war or global catastrophe. What's much scarier is what's happening, the push alert I got on my phone while we've been on this conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I find that the thought of getting stuck in a metro is like terrifying. The thought that in a moment of crisis, I would behave the way Claire behaved is significantly more terrifying. Because one of these is like, well, if that's going to happen, it's going to happen. There's nothing I can do about it. But one of these is like, am I that type of person? That is like, that is horror. For me, that's horror.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Rumaan, that was such a wonderful chat. You've been so fantastic and generous with your questions.
Thank you. Such a great pleasure.
And for anyone watching who's a regular B-List attendee, our final event for the year will be with the Honourable Tanya Plibersek discussing Upturn, A Better Normal After COVID-19, which for many reasons I feel is the perfect book to round out the year because obviously it's been a year of horrors, but there are many ways that politics and our finances and sort of federal treasury and our attitude towards each other and our systems, like this could be an opportunity to create something new going into 2021 rather than just trying to get back to normal. And I think there is potentially a source of optimism and some more silver linings if we try hard enough. And that's on Thursday, the 26th. And we'll put all the information online. But for now, just again, thank you so much, Rumaan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
What a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.